Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Marx's Concept of Intrinsic Value by Andrew Kliman. Excuse me. This paper aims to show that the concept of intrinsic value, value as distinct from exchange value, became an increasingly important element of Karl Marx's critique of political economy. Footnote: I wish to thank Kevin Anderson, Paresh Chattopadhyay, Peter Hudis, Ted McGlone, Patrick Murray, Alejandro Ramos Martinez, Bruce Roberts, and two anonymous referees for their unusually helpful criticisms and suggestions. The usual caveat applies. End footnote. The existence of the distinction is not unknown, but the distinction's importance to Marx's work is underappreciated, and the nature of the distinction is often misunderstood. Section 1 illustrates that misunderstandings and lack of recognition of Marx's concept of intrinsic value are widespread, and it suggests that they are partly responsible for the claims that Marx's value theory is logically inconsistent. Section 2 traces the process by which Marx developed the distinction between value and exchange value, which had not been made explicitly in his work through the 1859 contribution to the critique of political economy. Section 3 analyzes the first section of Capital, showing that where Marx is commonly thought to be advancing a, quote, labor theory of value, end quote, Marx's concern is rather to establish the existence of value as distinct from exchange value. Section 4 discusses the significance of the intrinsic value concept, suggesting that Marx employed it to transform value from a category referring to relations between things to one referring to relations between humans, workers, and things, and that the concept thus helped Marx unify his value theory, his analysis of capitalist production, and his theory of fetishism. Section 1. Common misconceptions. Many examples could be adduced to show the concept of intrinsic value and the distinction between value and exchange value are often misunderstood. I hope that 4 will suffice to illustrate the point. Foley, for one, writes that, quote, the commodity, can also be exchanged for other commodities. This characteristic of exchangeability Marx calls value. It is important to understand that Marx views value as a substance contained in definite quantities in every commodity, end quote. Duncan Foley. Actually, what Marx calls value is not the characteristic of exchangeability, but the common property all commodities possess. Things which, in Marx's terminology, have no value and are thus not commodities, such as land and securities, are also exchangeable. It is unclear, moreover, what meaning can be ascribed to the notion that, quote, the characteristic of exchangeability, end quote, is, quote, contained in commodities, much less in, quote, definite quantities, end quote. Ernest Mandel writes that, quote, money, is above all a commodity in the value of which all other commodities express their own exchange value, end quote. Mandel. As a statement of Marx's view, this is rather muddled. Mandel seems to mean that, quote, money, is above all the commodity that is the socially recognized form of value or exchange value, in the body of which all other commodities express their own values, end quote, which, however, is something rather different. Where Marx writes in Capital that, quote, exchange value is the mode of expression, the, quote, form of appearance, end quote, of a content distinguishable from it, end quote, i.e. value, Meek misconstrues this as a statement that the substance of value must be something distinguishable from the commodity, and not that value is distinguishable from exchange value. Footnote. Taken in isolation, Marx's statement may indeed seem to suggest that the commodity, not value, is the, quote, content, end quote, that appears in the form of exchange value, but I do not think this reading makes sense in context. In any case, at a later point in the chapter, Marx clarified that exchange value is the form of appearance of value itself. A commodity's, quote, value possesses its own particular form of manifestation, This form of manifestation is exchange value, end quote. Marx. These matters will be discussed in more detail below. End footnote. Given that this treatise on the labor theory of value does not recognize any difference between the concept of value as developed in the Critique of Political Economy, in which value and exchange value are not distinguished explicitly, and the corresponding argument in Capital, this is perhaps not surprising. Yet perhaps the most telling sign of the confusion that surrounds the relation between value and exchange value in Marx's work is Schumpeter's ambivalent and self-contradictory statement that Marx's, quote, theory of value is the Ricardian theory of value, ... There is plenty of difference in wording, method of deduction, and sociological implication, but there is none in the bare theorem, which alone matters to the theorists of today. It may, however, be open to question whether this is all that mattered to Marx himself. Marx is under the same delusion as Aristotle, that value, though a factor in the determination of relative prices, is yet different from, and exists independently of, relative prices or exchange relations. The proposition that the value of a commodity is the amount of labor embodied in the commodity can hardly mean anything else. If so, then there is a difference between Ricardo and Marx, since Ricardo's values are simply exchange values or relative prices. It is worthwhile to mention this because if we could accept this view of value, much of Marx's theory that seems to us untenable or even meaningless would cease to be so. Of course we cannot, end quote. Joseph Schumpeter. In accordance with the, quote, Whig interpretation, end quote, of the history of economic thought, Schumpeter suggests that, quote, value in Marx's work means, quote, exchange value. His own, quote, delusion to the contrary notwithstanding, because that is what it means to the, quote, theorist of today, end quote, who possesses a truer understanding of the matter. Yet as Schumpeter himself admits, he consigns himself to judge as, quote, untenable or even meaningless, end quote, much of Marx's theory that, quote, would cease to be so, end quote, were the opposite interpretation adopted. Many others have also judged much of Marx's work as, quote, untenable or even meaningless, end quote, because they have translated into, quote, modern terms. Marx's account of the transformation of values into production prices and his law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, in particular, have been shown to be self-contradictory if and when the issues in theoretical categories are translated into simultaneous equations. A necessary element of that translation is precisely the reduction of the concept of value to exchange value, parenthesis, relative price, ratio of exchange, and parenthesis, alone. Bortkovich begins his famous critique of Marx by stating that when referring to, quote, the quantitative incongruity of value and price, ... value can have no other meaning than that of a magnitude which indicates how many units of the goods serving as a measure of value are obtained in exchange for a commodity, ... In this sense, value is merely the index of an exchange relationship, and must not be confused with ... quote, absolute value, end quote. Bortkovich. This premise underlies all the revisions intended to correct or complete Marx's account of the value production price transformation. From that of Bortkovich to the present, values and prices are conceived as two self-contained and discordant systems of exchange ratios. Marx's account therefore seems logically inconsistent because, although outputs exchange in the proportions that ensure uniform profitability, Marx's account leaves inputs, the value of constant and variable capital advanced, quote, in value terms, end quote, which is taken to mean that they exchange in proportion to the quantities of labor needed to reproduce them. Once, however, value is understood as intrinsic value, as a quantum of abstract labor congealed in commodities, or the monetary expression thereof, the value of constant and variable capital advanced is no longer synonymous with the labor time needed to reproduce the inputs acquired by means of these advances. If one accepts the demonstration in Capital Volume 1 that exchange cannot alter the total value in existence, then, even though the inputs exchange at prices that differ from their values, the capital advance for these inputs remains, to use Marx's ubiquitous expression, a sum of value. If one accepts the demonstration in Capital Volume 1 that exchange cannot alter the total value in existence, then even though the inputs exchange at prices that differ from their values, the capital advance for these inputs remains, to use Marx's ubiquitous expression, a sum of value. That Marx started from the, quote, value of constant and variable capital, therefore, does not imply that Marx implicitly assumed that inputs exchange at inputs values. That's a crazy idea that would even be someone's... I don't know, it seems like, maybe I'm ignorant, but that seems like a wild thing to think that Marx would assume in the actual world that commodities exchange at their values as opposed to their prices of production, or even more concretely, market prices. That's wild to me. The Acchetio theorem, which reportedly refutes Marx's law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, also reduces value to exchange value. Acchetio's profit rate is one in which only relative prices matter. Because the denominator of Acchetio's profit rate is not the sum of value advanced for inputs before production, but the inputs post-production replacement cost, changes in their absolute prices over the course of the production period are removed. Hence, if prices fall during the period, due to technical change, for instance, Marx's profit rate, the rate of return on the actual capital advanced, can fall, even though Acchetio's replacement cost-based rate must rise. The point is not that the allegations of internal inconsistency can be dismissed merely by recognizing that Marx had a concept of intrinsic value that is irreducible to exchange value. These issues are much more complex than that. Nevertheless, it is partly on the basis of the distinction between value and exchange value that the, quote, temporal single system, end quote, interpretation of Marx's value theory has demonstrated that Marx's transformation account and the law of the falling profit rate can indeed be understood in a manner that renders them internally consistent. Footnote: see, for example, the works of Carcetti, Dehaene, Freeman, Kliman, and McGlone in Freeman and Carcetti's edited volume from 1996. See also Kliman and McGlone, 1999. End footnote. Section 2. Development of the value/exchange value distinction. Classical political economy distinguished between two meanings of value, value in use and value in exchange. The concept of, quote, real, or, quote, absolute value was also present, especially in the work of Ricardo, but it was not distinguished clearly from exchangeable value, nor did it play a significant role even in Ricardo's thought. In this case, as in most others, Marx at first employed the economic categories as they had been presented by the classicists. Through the contribution to the critique of political economy of 1859, Marx's work did not distinguish between value, parenthesis, or intrinsic value, in parenthesis, and exchange value in any clear fashion. In Marx's writings of the next 13 years, however, the distinction was increasingly sharpened and made into a focal point of his analysis. This section traces that process. Rubin was perhaps the first to note in print the conceptual breakthrough contained in Capital's distinction between exchange value and value. A contribution to the critique of political economy had made a, quote, smooth and imperceptible, end quote, passage between the two in its opening pages, and it had used the term, quote, exchange value to cover both concepts. Apparently independently, Raya Dunayevskaya later recognized the same thing and suggested that, quote, as late as the publication of Critique of Political Economy in 1859, Marx still used exchange value in the sense of bracket a synonym for and bracket value, and not in the sense of value form. Marx still was, quote, taking for granted that, quote, everyone knows, end quote, that production relations are really involved in the exchange of things, end quote. Dunayevskaya, 1988. Dunayevskaya's textual analysis locates this change as part of a more general shift in emphasis on Marx's part. Marx had at first stressed the fantastical form of appearance of production relations under capitalism, yet increasingly, and especially with the 1872 second German edition and the 1872 to 1875 French edition of Capital, written after Marx's experience with the, quote, free and associated labor, end quote, of the Paris Commune, he came to emphasize the, quote, perverted nature of capitalist production relations as what makes the fantastical appearance necessary. Footnote. In the Civil War in France, Marx wrote that the communards wanted to, quote, transform, the means of production, land, and capital, into instruments of free and associated labor, end quote. In Chapter 1 of Capital, Marx envisages a society in which production, quote, becomes production by freely associated, bracket, persons, parenthesis, mention, end parenthesis, end bracket, and stands under their conscious and planned control, end quote. Marx. Yeah, this is like kind of like Dunayevskaya's whole thing, right? At least in, to my understanding, like, I'm not an expert on Dunayevskaya, but to my understanding, this is a whole thing that, that basically, like, the class struggle was the reason for Marx's consistent re-editing of Capital, as opposed to, like, the emphasizing the form of presentation of very abstract concepts like exchange value and value. You could also probably question Marx's interpretation of the Paris Commune, but I don't know. That's not really something I can speak on, or it's even not even necessary to talk about here. But yeah, and there's very good critiques of Dunayevskaya's analysis. One of the big ones being Peter Beilhartz's book on Trotskyism in general. He has a chapter that's on this channel critiquing James and Dunayevskaya. But also a very important one, in my opinion, is if you go on this channel, you'll also find a critique by Paul Maddock of Marxism and Freedom, which kind of critiques this kind of idea that, like, it was like really the working class and their struggle against capital that really, motivated the constant revision and the development of analysis in Capital, and not the appropriate presentation of categories or some more scientific questions. There's this idea in, like, a lot of, like, humanistic kind of stuff that really tries to, like, ground everything that Marx does in some kind of, like, I don't know, there's political reasons for everything he does and not conceptual theoretical reasons, right? But yeah, check out the piece by Paul Maddock. I'm not really giving the critiques of this perspective justice, and it's not really hasn't really been laid out thus far, but just this idea that, the Paris Commune was the reason Marx, struggled so hard to write Capital. Seems dubious. Or it fundamentally changed his whole outlook on the critique of political economy. That seems very dubious to me. Not that the Paris Commune wasn't important for Marx in other capacities, but I would say the distinction between value and exchange value is not one of the things that Marx picked up from the Paris Commune. That seems like a very, very big stretch. Anyway, a formative element in Marx's change in emphasis was his reading of Samuel Bailey's critical dissertation. Rubin argues persuasively that Samuel Bailey, who had argued that a thing's value is merely the amount of another thing for which it is exchanged, was the, quote, opponent Marx had in mind when he distinguished value from exchange value in Capital. Footnote. Well, it's just a citation. But as a side note, there's a very good paper by Patrick Murray, which is precisely about Bailey's influence on Marx. And this is just kind of like a general thing that, like, you know, which is like, what's the word? Is that classical political economy, say, especially represented in Ricardo, is trying to look for like an invariable, like, or like a constant measure of value, which he kind of grounded in labor. Whereas Samuel Bailey kind of just had this idea that, like, there is no kind of value, there's just like exchange rates between things. And Samuel Bailey's kind of writing on this topic fundamentally influenced or like forced Marx to sophisticate his arguments on the presentation of value, and also demonstrate the way that, like, value necessarily is represented in exchange value, right? I don't know what Kliman's going to say in this piece, but that's a very important concept in a lot of the value form approaches, which I don't think Kliman is particularly warm towards, is that value must necessarily represent itself in things, maybe not necessarily like things as in like gold, but as in like money. Money is the necessary representation of value, and not just kind of like an arbitrary veil of some kind. So I think basically what I'm saying is that Patrick Murray kind of grounds, doesn't view Samuel Bailey as merely as an intellectual opponent. Obviously he was, but also someone who kind of like forced Marx to think through the relationship between value and exchange value, and not just say that they were distinct, but in fact that they mutually depended upon one another. The essence, that which would be value, and the appearance, which would be exchange value, necessitate one another. Essence depends upon appearance. To use some heavily Hegelian language. The other thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this too, and I've said this in other videos, but people a lot of times, like, this kind of Bailey's kind of notion is kind of like a proto, to my understanding at least, a proto sort of like marginal utility conception of value, which is just kind of basically oriented around like supply and demand, and there's no kind of like core kind of, like, there is no value basically, there's just exchange. I think one of the things that's like kind of like a popular prejudice amongst like just Marxist economists or people who are influenced by Marx, that the marginal utility, the marginalist revolution, so-called, in the latter half or even latter third of the 19th century was almost exclusively like a political maneuver, because it kind of like cut exploitation out of the conversation about capitalism in bourgeois social sciences. And while that is true, there people say, like, I'm pretty sure this is like Michael Heinrichs, and I think this would probably be any of the value form proponents, was that Marx was a critic of classical political economy, and that there was actual contradictions present in existing labor theories of value, or the going labor theory of value that Marx challenged, right? And one of the ways he challenged it was saying, okay, well, value, while indeed being a separate thing, must necessarily exchange itself, must necessarily like represent itself in an exchange relationship. It's a fundamentally social character as opposed to like a natural, like metaphysical quality of like products of labor as such. So basically, sorry for going on so long, but basically there was problems with classical theories of value that marginalist theory was actually responding to in its distorted, in its problematic way. Anyway, the critique of political economy was published in June 1859. Only later in that year did Marx first exert the critical dissertation. His economic notebook of 1861-63 contains an extended discussion of Bailey's work and that of the anonymous author of Observations on certain verbal disputes in political economy. And if you didn't know, the manuscripts of 1861-63, I don't think there's only been really like one book by Enrique Dussel which kind of like goes through what analyzes these notebooks, but also the economic notebooks would have been are important because the economic notebooks are where of 1861-63 is where theories of surplus value, the books that were edited by Kautsky into the theories of surplus value can be found in these 1861-63 manuscripts. And just while I'm talking about this as well, what was made of Capital Volume 3 was largely drawn from manuscripts from 1864 to 65, which was before Capital Volume 1 was published. Which I think is an important fact when considering like the transformation problem, the fact that Marx was already analyzing prices of production prior and market prices prior to his Capital Volume 1, which displays his theory of value. It wasn't something that he came up with later, trying to contradicting himself later. Anyway, Marx's economic notebook of 1861-63 contains an extended discussion of Bailey's work and that of the anonymous author of Observations on certain verbal disputes in political economy. In these 40-plus pages, Marx for the first time begins to work out an argument that would later appear in different form in the opening pages of Capital. Marx endeavors to show that, since two commodities that exchange are qualitatively equal, they share a common property, that what is meant by value is precisely this common property, substance, or, quote, third thing that they both contain, not the one commodity or the other. Footnote: a superficially similar argument in Marx's 1857-58 Grundrisse attempts to distinguish a commodity's value from a commodity's physical existence in order to explain the necessity of money, not to identify value itself as a common property of commodities. End footnote. A commodity's value thus, quote, belongs to, end quote, it, so to speak, rather than, quote, belonging to, end quote, the other commodity for which it exchanges. Hence, rather than establishing commodities' values, as Bailey had argued, The act of exchange only expresses the value that commodities have prior to and independent of this act. Footnote. In Capital, Marx argued that commodities' prices, as well as their values, are determined before they enter circulation. The quantity theory of money, quote, had its roots in the absurd hypothesis, ... that commodities enter into the process of circulation without a price, and money enters without a value, end quote. Marx. Quote, the value of a commodity is expressed in the commodity's price before the commodity enters into circulation, and is therefore a precondition of circulation, not its result, end quote. Marx, end footnote. Just another side note, what Kliman's saying here, this statement that he says, a commodity's value thus, quote, belongs to, end quote, it, so to speak, rather than, quote, belonging to, end quote, the other commodity for which it exchanges. That makes it sound as if, like, the commodity's value is inherent to a particular commodity as to and that its substance is not purely social. As if it's not a substance that is shared with the other commodity, as if it's something that it has on its own. One of the things that Michael Heinrich says in his introduction to Capital is value is the kind of thing like a fire truck and an apple are both red independently of each other, right? They have the quality of being red in distinction from each other, whether with no relation to each other. Value is the kind of relationship where the apple and the fire truck are only red when they're brought into relation with one another. So it's not something that's like intrinsic in the substance of a particular commodity itself. And you can decide for yourself whether or not you think that's right or not. But just saying that what Kliman is saying here has some controversy about it. Anyway, this complex of issues will be discussed in greater detail in the next section, which deals with Capital's opening pages. Here I would like to focus on two other dimensions of Marx's critique, both of which concern Ricardo's distinction between, quote, absolute and, quote, relative value. Earlier in the 1861-63 notebook, Marx argued that Ricardo had not defined this difference clearly and had not held to it consistently, and that Bailey, in claiming that the Ricardian concept of value was contradictory, had exploited these problems. And that's what I was talking about before. Moreover, Marx believed that Ricardo's distinction was itself imprecise, and that this problem was the basis of Bailey's incorrect charge, incorrect, charge, that the Ricardians had absolutized value, hypostatizing value into an entity instead of a relation. Thus, Marx argued that value is not absolute but relative in two different senses, the latter of which Ricardo had called absolute. Quote, all commodities, insofar as commodities are exchange values, are only relative expressions of social labor time, and their relativity consists by no means solely of the ratio in which they exchange for one another, but by the ratio of them all to this social labor, which is their substance, end quote. Marx. This point is not only a, quote, technical one. It enables Marx to criticize the fetishization of things he detects in the concept of value held by Bailey and the author of the Observations. When he makes, apparently for the first time, the famous value is, quote, third thing, end quote, argument, quote, to estimate the value of A and B, A must have a value independent of that in B, and both must be equal to a third thing expressed in both of them, end quote. End parenthesis. Marx immediately cautions that, quote, it is quite wrong to say that the value of a commodity is thereby transformed from something relative into something absolute. On the contrary, as a use value, the commodity appears as something independent. On the other hand, as value, it appears as something merely contingent, something merely determined by its relation to socially necessary, equal, simple labor time, end quote. Marx. Marx thus turns the tables on his opponents, charging them with absolutizing value. The author of the Observations, quote, transforms value into something absolute, quote, a property of things, end quote, instead of seeing in it only something relative, end quote. Marx. Parenthesis, as I will discuss presently, Marx agrees that value is a property of commodities, but argues that this is not due to their existence as things, end parenthesis. Okay, so that's good. Similarly, quote, Bailey is a fetishist in that Bailey conceives value, as a relation of objects to one another. As a relation of objects to one another, well, it is only representation in objects, an objective expression of a relation between men, a social relation, the relationship of men to their reciprocal productive activity, end quote. Marx. Marx is here criticizing these authors not only for their failure to recognize that value is determined by labor time, in claiming that they absolutize and fetishize value, Marx is criticizing the notion that value is a transhistorical, immutable reality, and that production aimed at expanding value, the capitalist mode of production, is a, quote, absolute form of social production. These criticisms appear prominently in the section on the fetishism of the commodity in the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, which culminates with a critique of Bailey and the author of the Observations. They are prefigured here in the Notebook, arguing that, quote, as values, commodities are social magnitudes, that is to say, something absolutely different from their, quote, properties as, quote, things, end quote, end quote. Marx states that, quote, where labor is communal, the relations of men in men's social production do not manifest themselves as, quote, values of, quote, things, end quote, end quote. Marx. And noting the variable relation between the amount of commodities and the amount of labor needed to produce those commodities, parenthesis, the second sense of relative value, end parenthesis, Marx suggests that because Ricardo, quote, argues that social wealth does not depend on the value of the commodities produced, it should have been all the more clear to Ricardo that a mode of production whose exclusive aim is surplus value, in other words, which is based on the relative property of the mass of the producers, based on the relative poverty of the mass of the producers, cannot possibly be the absolute form of the production of wealth, end quote. Marx. It is noteworthy that such considerations come in the midst of, and are tightly linked to, what is perhaps Marx's most technical discussion of value. The analytical distinctions Marx makes here are ones that will help enable Marx to forge a unity among value theory, the process of production, and the theory of fetishism. Marx's identification of a second meaning of relative value, the relativity or variability of a commodity's value, in terms of labor time, is also closely related to his developing emphasis on the temporal character of value. Marx stresses this in opposition to Bailey's argument that, quote, value is a relation between contemporary commodities, end quote. Bailey, cited in Marx. Since, in Bailey's view, the concept of an intrinsic value distinct from exchange value is otiose, or otiose. What the hell does that mean? Serving no practical purpose or result.
Odios.
Odios is what the internet is telling me it's pronounced. Since in Bailey's view the concept of an intrinsic value distinct from exchange value is odiose, Bailey concludes that a commodity's, quote, own value cannot be said to rise or fall. One commodity simply exchanges for more or less of another at different times, and it is futile and meaningless to attribute their changed relationship to a change, quote, within, end quote, either. By means of the, quote, third thing, end quote, argument developed in these pages, Marx holds fast to the concept of intrinsic value. Having rejected Bailey's premise, Marx rejects Bailey's conclusion as well. Values at different times can certainly be compared, and Bailey is a, quote, fool to think otherwise. Quote, is it not a fact that, in the process of circulation or the process of reproduction of capital, the value of one period is constantly compared with that of another period, an operation upon which production itself is based, end quote. Marx. Indeed, Marx now situates the whole process of circulation of capital, money, commodity, money, prime, within the context of a historically variable intrinsic value, quote, value in process, end quote, or, quote, dynamic value, end quote. Quote, the relation between the value antecedent to production and the value which results from production. Capital as antecedent value as capital in contrast to profit, constitutes the all-embracing and decisive factor in the whole process of capitalist production. It is not only an independent expression of value, as in money, but dynamic value, value which maintains value self in a process in which use values pass through the most varied forms. Thus, in capital, the independent existence of value is raised to a higher power than in money, end quote. Marx. Two important points are made here. First, the very existence of profit demonstrates that values are indeed comparable over time, since the concept of profit is such a comparison. The same could be said with reference to credit. Second, the dynamics of capitalism as a value-producing system can only be understood once value is conceived as something independent of exchange value, something that, quote, maintains itself, end quote, or persists through the production process. This conception of value as something intertemporal will figure prominently in Chapter 4 of Capital Volume 1, where Marx also calls it, quote, value, as a self-moving substance, end quote, and is endowed with an aim, quote, Verwertung, end quote, parenthesis, value self-expansion, end parenthesis. In Volume 2, moreover, in a passage in which Marx will again criticize Bailey for denying the intertemporal comparability of values, the same concept reappears as the, quote, Verselbständigung, end quote, parenthesis, autonomization, end parenthesis, of value. Here, Marx is concerned not with the self-expansion of value, but especially with value's interruption, economic crisis. Technological advance leads to, quote, revolutions in value, end quote, which in turn cause already existing sums of value advanced as capital to be destroyed. Value thus becomes an autonomous power. Quote, if the social capital value suffers a revolution in value, it can come about that, bracket, a capitalist, end bracket, individual capital succumbs to this and is destroyed because it cannot meet the conditions of this movement of value, These periodic revolutions in value thus confirm what they ostensibly refute: the independence which value acquires as capital, and which is maintained and intensified through capital's movement. The most easy way to think about this, I mean, maybe this isn't a bad example, but I always think about, market-dependent farmers versus like you know independent farmers versus like an agribusiness, right? um, Maybe that's actually not a good thing, correct thing to say. But say if you, I guess what I'm saying, I guess what I should say is like, if you invest, if you spend a lot of money on the inputs of if a capitalist spends a lot of money on the inputs to a production process, and another capitalist spends less on their production process, that capitalist will either the second capitalist will either achieve more value, more profit by selling at the same price than the one who used the really expensive inputs, right? Generally, what they'll try to do via competition, right, is to sell the commodity cheaper than their competitors and thus gain a greater market share. All right. So if you basically, I think the idea that's being expressed here in Marx is the idea is that if you spend if you purchase a means of production that are inefficient and or more costly than your competitors, you will you risk being destroyed. So, and in this case, it's particularly talking about the role of invention in that, right? So if you are using a inefficient machinery compared to your competitors, and you've spent a lot of money, if you've sunk a lot of money into that inefficient production already, and you can't readily sell it, you're going to be in trouble as a capitalist. Anyway, thus, whereas Bailey had pointed to the variability of commodities' values as evidence that the concept of value is something distinct from a momentary exchange value is a mirage, Marx argues that this variability implies the very opposite. The expansion and destruction of capital is the expansion and destruction of value. Because Bailey had conflated value and exchange value, Bailey was unable to recognize that value exists outside the process of exchange. But the independent, abiding existence of value is no, quote, mere abstraction, ... The movement of industrial capital is this abstraction in action, end quote. Marx. And it's like I said, just to point out a controversy here is like, it was the meaning of value existing outside of the process of exchange. I think there's always a very important distinction to be made between ideal value and actually realized value. That's always an important thing. If value is not redeemed via sale, you cannot really demonstrate that it had. It seems to me, at least, and it seems like a lot of people who come from like a value form position would say that value cannot be proven to have existed. It is not proved as part of society's social labor via the act of exchange, right? So, if it does eventually get sold, if the commodity possessing that value is eventually sold, then you can say that, of course, that value existed outside of the process of exchange, and it proved itself in the exchange process. But if that value is never manifested in an exchange, is never realized in an exchange, you can't say that value existed. And you can see this, in the very obvious case, right? If a capitalist, say a capitalist produces a bunch of things and has this idea of the value that they're worth, and then cannot sell those things, he cannot the metamorphosis of value which is value can only take the form of metamorphosis, by the way, fundamentally breaks down. If you if you produce commodities and you produce a commodity that ideally has an augmented value, and you cannot sell them, they have no value at all, as far as and you can't purchase the next round of inputs in the for the valorization process to reinitiate. So the value existing outside the process of exchange, precisely what that means is is not what's the word? It's controversial. What is the meaning of that? And just as a side note, I'm writing on for part of my master's research. It's like I'm writing on Raya Dunayevskaya and her theory of state capitalism in the Soviet Union. Just one of my topics within that overall project of Trotskyist and post-Trotskyist critiques of the degenerated worker state thesis. And it's like she consistently talks about, and like just as general of like state capitalists who kind of have like the idea of the USSR being a single capitalist firm, or it's a single one giant factory, basically, conception of state capitalism in the USSR. They don't always precisely say, when they say that the USSR is supporting creating surplus value, where is that surplus value being realized at? Is it being realized on the world market? And if it is, what is the significance of autarky there? If you just have the idea of just kind of like using the products of surplus labor in order to industrialize a country or whatever, without the mediation of exchange, you cannot say that surplus labor is taking the specific social form of surplus value. And I don't think you can say that the USSR was capitalist if there's no exchange mechanism by which this ostensible surplus value is realized. It's a surplus, and it's the product of extreme, brutally repressive exploitation. It certainly was nothing approaching communism or socialism or a worker state or anything like that, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. But that does, like, if without that kind of without the very critical moment of sale, you can't say that surplus value is in existence. Surplus value, and especially when you start talking about accumulation of surplus value is 100% predicated on the sale of existing surplus value. It's not just surplus labor and surplus value are distinct concepts. But that has nothing to do with this piece. This is just me thinking out loud. And maybe, I was part of the reason why I was motivated to look at this is like, what is the relationship of Dunayevskaya to Kliman's theory of value? Anyway, sorry for that particular tangent. Seemed especially kind of off topic, but anyway. Another moment of development of the value/exchange value distinction occurs with Marx's revision of Volume 1 of Capital for the French and Second German editions. I will examine the revised text below, but I wish to note here a few of the ways in which the opening section of the 1867 edition differs from the Capital we know. First, the discussion of the value character of the commodity, from the initial mention of exchange value to the statement that commodities are crystallized labor, is about 1/3 shorter in the 1867 edition. One reason is that the distinction between abstract and concrete labor is made only later in the text, not when Marx is deriving abstract labor as the substance of value. Second, the passage in the revised editions in which Marx elucidates that, quote, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the, quote, form of appearance, end quote, of a content distinguishable from it, end quote, does not appear in the 1867 edition. At a later point in the text, when investigating what commodities have in common, Marx does write that, quote, commodities are first of all simply to be considered as values independent of their exchange relationship or from the form in which they appear as exchange values, end quote. Marx. This formulation seems to distinguish less sharply between the content and the form of value. It is, moreover, stated as a premise of an argument, and thus lacks the force of a conclusion that exchange value is something different from value. Third, in the 1867 edition, Marx writes that the wheat's, quote, exchange value remains unchanged, regardless of whether it is expressed in X, boot blacking, Y, soap, Z, gold, etc. It must therefore be distinguishable from these, its various manners of expression. Its various manners of expression, end quote. Marx. Yet these, quote, manners of expression, end quote, are the wheat's exchange values. What actually, quote, remains unchanged, end quote, is a common element which these commodities all express. The surrounding text clarifies that this was what Marx meant, but later editions, perhaps in the interest of greater precision, do not suggest that exchange value is the common element. This and other revisions, as well as the expansion of this part of the text, serve as indications that he was not satisfied with the presentation in the first edition. New section, Section 3. Capital's analysis of the commodity. In this section, I will argue that the primary purpose of Marx's analysis at the beginning of Capital was to establish a clear distinction between value and exchange value, to break from the conception of value as a ratio in exchange. To break from the conception of value as a ratio in exchange. This interpretation differs sharply from the common view that in the opening pages, Marx was instead advancing a, quote, labor theory of value, i.e. a theory that exchange ratios are governed by relative quantities of labor, at least as a, quote, first approximation, end quote, to reality. In response to Adolf Wagner's critique, Marx emphasized that, quote, neither, quote, value nor, quote, exchange value are my subjects, but the commodity, ... What I start out from is the simplest social form in which the labor product is presented in contemporary society, and this is the, quote, commodity, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx surely did hold that value is determined by labor time, but I question the view that he attempted to explain relative prices on the basis of labor time. In any case, my argument here is that the opening section makes no such attempt. End footnote. My thesis that the distinction between value and exchange value is the focal point of Marx's initial analysis may seem to contradict this point. Actually, however, it reinforces Marx's point, since Marx's analysis discloses that value, unlike exchange value, is an intrinsic property of the commodity itself. Moreover, a major reason commentators have read a labor theory of exchange ratios into the chapter is that they seem to have misconstrued the object of analysis, taking it to be exchange and the determination of exchange ratios. Thus, to establish my contrary thesis, I will frequently have reason to emphasize that Marx's object of analysis is the commodity itself. Marx does, of course, examine the, quote, exchange relation, the expression of one commodity's equality with another. But, as we shall see, Marx does so in order to establish that value is intrinsic to the commodity. It is only in the second chapter, entitled The Process of Exchange, that Marx begins to investigate the act of exchange. The title of chapter 1 is, quote, The Commodity. Although the title of the first section makes clear that the two, quote, factors of the commodity are use value and value, Marx first states that commodities are use values and, quote, material bearers of exchange value. Rather than this indicating that value and exchange value are the same for Marx, Marx is simply adopting the standpoint of the economist, but only provisionally. As Marx writes later in the chapter, in a passage that was not part of the first edition, quote, when at the beginning of this chapter we said in the customary manner that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, this was, strictly speaking, wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility and a, quote, value. A commodity appears as the twofold thing a commodity really is as soon as the commodity's value possesses its own particular form of manifestation, ... This form of manifestation is exchange value, and the commodity never has this form of manifestation when looked at in isolation, but only when it is in a value relation or an exchange relation with a second commodity. End quote. Marx. Marx thus begins from the, quote, form of manifestation, end quote, as part of an analytical strategy meant to enable the reader to see, quote, beyond the exchange relation of commodities, to focus on the commodity itself in isolation. Indeed, Marx moves immediately to distinguish the content, value, from the content, values, form of manifestation. Because exchange value, quote, appears as the ratio in which one thing exchanges for another, and because this ratio is constantly changing, quote, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e. an exchange value that is inseparably connected with the commodity, inherent in the commodity, seems a contradiction in terms. Let us consider the matter more closely, end quote. Marx. The, quote, matter Marx wishes to consider is not whether the quantitative exchange ratio is accidental or determinate. Instead, it is whether value is an accidental phenomenon, one that arises only contingently in and through the act of exchange, a phenomenon that is nothing other than this relation between the things, quote, something ... purely relative, end quote. Or is the opposite possible, that value is intrinsic, quote, inherent in, end quote, the commodity itself. Thus it is in order to demonstrate that value is indeed inherent in the commodity that Marx turns to the exchange relation. The subject matter is not exchange, but the commodity. Marx notes that because the commodity, a quarter of wheat, is exchanged for a variety of things, quote, in the most diverse proportions, end quote, a quarter of wheat, quote, has many exchange values instead of one exchange value, end quote. The quarter of wheat's exchange values are the other things for which the quarter of wheat exchanges. If 5 tins of boot polish, 10 yards of silk, or 1/35 ounce of gold, etc., exchanged for a quarter of wheat, the quarter of wheat's exchange values are 5 tins of boot polish, 10 yards of silk, or the 1/35 ounce of gold. Marx is showing that when value is taken to be exchange value or relative price, value is not a, quote, property of the commodity at all, but is another commodity, the physical body of the other commodity itself. Yet although the various exchange values of wheat are physically different, each is equally, quote, the exchange value of the quarter of wheat. As exchange values, they must be of, quote, equal magnitude, and therefore they, quote, express something equal, end quote. Marx. Footnote. It seems to me that this conclusion follows necessarily once one grants Marx's initial premise. He states not only that the quarter of wheat, quote, is exchanged for other commodities, end quote, but that the wheat itself, quote, has a, quote, exchange value, parenthesis, or is a, quote, material bearer, end quote, of exchange value, end parenthesis. Given this premise, Marx succeeds in showing that the wheat, in fact, quote, has many exchange values instead of one exchange value, end quote. That each of these exchange values is an interchangeable expression of the same thing, the wheat's, quote, exchange value, and that they thus, quote, express something equal, end quote. Any challenge to this conclusion must therefore challenge the initial premise. One must argue that, although the wheat exchanges for other commodities, the wheat does not, in any other sense, quote, have an exchange value. Such a situation is certainly possible. Indeed, I believe it obtains whenever exchanges are merely contingent, ephemeral events. Yet Marx was here considering capitalist society. In this society, it is a fact that, even apart from and prior to any exchange of our wheat, we think and say that it, quote, has a value, parenthesis, or price, and parenthesis, of, end quote, quote, is worth, end quote, so much money. Moreover, we act on these words, quote, equally the expression of something else. Marx thus concludes, quote, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the, quote, form of appearance, end quote, of a content distinguishable from exchange value, end quote. Parenthesis, it is only on the next page that this content is finally denoted as, quote, value, end parenthesis. Marx is not concerned here with causality or magnitude, but is drawing out the relationship between and the distinction between the form and the content of this equality. Oh shit, I fucked up. Sorry, I fucked something up. I forgot that I was reading a footnote earlier. My bad. Such a situation is certainly possible. I believe it obtains whenever exchanges are merely contingent ephemeral events. Yet Marx was here considering capitalist society. In capitalist society is a fact that, even apart from and prior to any exchange of our wheat, we think and say that it, quote, has a value or price of, end quote, quote, is worth, end quote, so much money. Moreover, we act on this basis. We compute, quote, the value of, end quote, our assets and our, quote, net worth, end quote. We decide to buy items if, quote, they are worth, end quote, more than the sticker price, etc., and we do so before we exchange and whether or not we exchange. Yet one may object that even though Marx's premise that commodities, quote, have exchange values is our own premise as well, it is, quote, false, nonetheless. In one sense this is correct, and his theory of the fetishism of the commodity makes precisely the same point. But Marx was analyzing our social relations, how we act, speak, and think under capitalism. In this context, the premise is simply a fact, so the challenge fails. The foregoing has argued that Marx could not successfully have derived the equivalence of commodities to one another from the mere phenomenon of exchange, and that he instead derived it from a partial fact about capitalism. Commodities, quote, have exchange value. If this argument is correct, it lends additional support to the view that Chapter 1 of Capital analyzed specifically capitalist relations, the, quote, wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, end quote, and not, as many authors have traditionally contended, a pre- or non-capitalist exchange society. End footnote. Okay, so, end footnote. Sorry about that. They are all, in other words, quote, equally the expression of something else. Marx thus concludes, quote, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the, quote, form of appearance, end quote, of a content distinguishable from exchange value, end quote. Marx. Parenthesis, it is only on the next page that this content is finally denoted as, quote, value, end parenthesis. Marx is not concerned here with causality or magnitude, but is drawing out the relationship between and the distinction between the form and the content of this equality. Footnote. Quote, commodity is on the one hand use value and on the other hand, quote, value, not exchange value, since the mere form of appearance is not its proper content. Oh shit, that was a quote. Quote, commodity is, on the one hand, use value, on the other hand, quote, value, not exchange value, since the mere form of appearance is not its proper content, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The next paragraph seems to derive the same result by looking at just two commodities exchanging with one another. This apparent repetition can be understood in light of the subsequent development of exchange value in the third section of the chapter. As we have seen, Marx is seeking to dispel the semblance that exchange value is accidental. This semblance arises when the exchange relation is considered as the exchange of two commodities alone. In section 3, Marx will call this the, quote, accidental form, end quote, of value. To dispel the semblance, Marx takes up this form of value here in Capital's opening pages only after first having taken up what he will later call the, quote, total or expanded form of value, end quote, of value. The point is that once the equal content of each of a series of commodities is established, the equal content of two commodities can then be recognized more easily. Beginning with the total form of value also dispels the opposite illusion, an illusion which appears most strikingly in the, quote, money form of value, namely that the second commodity with which the first exchanges is value itself, is, quote, endowed with the form of value by nature itself, end quote, and that the first is therefore valuable by virtue of its exchange with the second. Thus, an examination of the total form helps demonstrate both that there is an identical content to each commodity, and that this content is distinct from any of the commodities themselves. Having first established this content, common to, but distinguishable from, all commodities, Marx can then turn back to the relation of two commodities and draw the conclusion that, quote, a common element of identical magnitude exists in two different things, ... both are therefore equal to a third thing, which in itself is neither the one or the other, end quote. Marx. This, quote, third thing, end quote, argument has frequently been misunderstood. Marx is not asking what allows commodities, much less use values as such, to exchange, as Böhm-Bawerk believed. Calling Marx's conclusion a, quote, assumption, Böhm-Bawerk argued that exchange, quote, change of ownership, end quote, involves, quote, inequality rather than equality, evidently because each owner wants the other commodity. Ironically, when Marx does finally turn to the process of exchange in Chapter 2, he states the same thing. Footnote, quote, all commodities are non-use values for their owners and use values for their non-owners. Consequently, commodities must all change hands, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Again, however, Marx's object of investigation in Chapter 1 is not exchange, but the nature of the commodity itself. Marx is not asking why the commodities are exchanged, instead of being hoarded or consumed, or what about the commodities enables them to be exchanged. He argues later in the text that products at first, quote, became exchangeable through the mutual desire of their owners to alienate them, end quote. Marx. Instead, Marx is asking, what do the commodities exchange? Instead, Marx is asking, what do the commodities exchange? Excuse me, what the hell? Instead, Marx is asking, as what? As what do the commodities exchange? As what do the commodities exchange? Footnote. See Marx. Quote, what is this unity of objects exchanged against each other? ... As what do they become exchangeable? As what do they become exchangeable? End quote. Marx. End footnote. Put differently, Marx derives the existence of intrinsic value from a postulated exchange of equivalents, not the converse. In the previous paragraph, Marx proceeded from the equal magnitudes of the exchange values to derive a content common to all the exchange values. Similarly here, Marx proceeds from the exchange of two equivalent commodities to derive those commodities' equality to a third thing. If, quote, 1/4 of corn equals X hundredweight of iron, end quote, then a common element of, quote, identical magnitude, end quote, exists in each. Quote, if A, then B, end quote, does not imply if B, then A, end quote. Marx. Moreover, Marx is still dealing with form and content. The causal determination and magnitude of the exchange ratio are not at issue here. Bumbaverk, among many others, apparently believed the opposite, when Bumbaverk objected that chemical elements do not unite, quote, because chemical elements possess an exactly equal degree of chemical affinity, end quote. Bumbaverk. Again, I have Bumbaverk's book on Marx on this channel. And anyway. Yet had Marx wished to state either as, quote, theory or as, quote, first approximation that 1/4 of corn exchanges for X hundredweight of iron, because in that precise ratio the two are of equal value, he was capable of doing so in clear and unambiguous terms. Footnote. Contrast the, quote, third thing, end quote, argument with the passage at the end of Chapter 5, in which Marx does state, but only as an assumption, that equal values exchange. Quote, the money owner, ... must buy his commodities at their value, and sell those commodities at their value. ... If prices actually differ from values, we must first reduce prices to values, i.e. disregard this situation as an accidental one, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Again, however, the, quote, third thing argument answers a very different question. As what? As what do commodities exchange? To understand Marx's subsequent argument, it is crucial to recognize that Marx has now indeed established that commodities exchange as bearers of an intrinsic value, a, quote, third thing, end quote, present in each. Marx now turns to a different question, quote, what is this third thing, end quote. It is also crucial to recognize that Since the common element has been shown to, quote, exist in, end quote, each commodity, the search is for a, quote, property, end quote, of the commodity itself. Marx thus discontinues the examination of the exchange relation. Marx thus discontinues the examination of the exchange relation, which Marx pursued precisely in order to establish that this third thing exists, and returns to an investigation of the commodity. It seems that failure to understand these points has led many critics to charge that Marx asserts, rather than proves, what the common element is, or that his proof is faulty, since some possible candidates, e.g., utility, scarcity, the commodity's existence as appropriated things, are not considered. It is quite true that the things could not exchange as commodities unless they were scarce, owned, and useful. But none of these is a property of the things themselves. All are relations between the things and people. But none of these is a property of the things themselves. All are relations between the things and people. Wouldn't socially necessary labor time be a relation between things and people as well? I don't know. Maybe he'll say the opposite. Parenthesis, although the usefulness of things is dependent on their physical properties, usefulness itself is not such a property, end parenthesis. The basis of the criticisms is a misconception of the object under investigation at this point. This does not mean that Marx proved that the common element is, parenthesis, abstract, and parenthesis, labor. First, Marx does not even state that it is, despite a popular belief to the contrary. Footnote. See Bumbawerk, 1984. Quote, labor is shown to be the sought-for common factor, end quote. C.K., 1979, quote, Marx's argument is, that in exchange, labor is the common property that regulates the terms of trade, end quote. K. End footnote. I think that's Jeffrey K. Marx actually writes, quote, only one property remains, that of being products of labor, end quote. Emphasis added. Here again, the error results from inattention to the fact that the commodity, not exchange or what regulates exchange, is the object of analysis. Second, once one recognizes that the object of analysis is the commodity itself, and that what Marx means by, quote, commodity is A, a useful thing that is also B, the product of labor, there is no need for proof. It's a weird sentence. Second, once one recognizes that the object of analysis is the commodity itself, and that what Marx means by, quote, commodity is A, a useful thing that is also B, the product of labor, there is no need for proof. That's it? That's all that constitutes a commodity for Marx? Is that what's being said? I don't know. Maybe it's not what's being said. Let's read on. Once all physical properties of the commodity that make the commodity useful are rejected as the common property, they are qualitative properties. But the exchange relation, as a quantitative relation, abstracts from the qualities of commodities. It is then self-evident that, quote, only one property remains, that of being products of labor, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Bumbawerk was perhaps justified in complaining that Marx had omitted to mention this from the start. What's he referring to here? that commodities are products of labor from the start. Yet Marx was following Ricardo's well-known delimitation of the term, quote, commodity, end footnote. What is not self-evident, what no one before Marx identified as the dual character of this labor. Footnote, quote, insofar as it finds its expression in value, quote, it, bracket, labor, end bracket, no longer possesses the same characteristics as when it is the creator of use values. I was the first to point out and examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The commodities are different not only as useful concrete things, but, for the same reason, also as the products of the different sorts of useful concrete laboring activities. Only as products of, quote, human labor in the abstract, end quote, are they the same. Marx. See that, and right there, that's a problem, right? Concrete labor is an abstraction. That's an abstraction too, right? You could say that's human labor in the abstract. So abstract labor means something more specific than just laboring as such, right? If that's the human labor in the abstract is a trans-historical feature of life. Concrete labor is an abstract, is a feature of everyday life, and obviously no one ever labors abstractly, right? But they always are laboring concretely. They're doing a concrete particular thing, but abstract labor is much more significant than just labor in the abstract. I don't know what I don't know what Kliman's gonna say, but like Heinrich says, is like, if Marx seriously thought he was the first person to consider human labor in the abstract, like just human, he's the first person to ever consider that labor takes on a variety of forms, and from that we can have the general abstraction of labor, he'd be full of shit. Abstract labor means something much more specific than that. Chris Arthur makes the point in one of his talks. It's with a talk with Alexander Kalinikos after the latter wrote a book called Deciphering Capital, and Chris Arthur was kind of brought in as like a critic of the book, or the critic of some of the assumptions, or just a contrary voice on the topic of capital. And he says like that kind of like there's a different types of universals, and you'd say that like the heterogeneity of labor reduced to just labor as such is like a concrete universal, which is distinct from, say, the character of abstract labor in Marx's critique of political economy, if that makes sense. Anyway, viewing commodities from the standpoint of what commodities have in common, then, what remains, according to Marx, is only a, quote, residue. Nothing physical, concrete, or useful about them, or the labor that produces them, is left. All that is left is a mere abstraction, a, quote, phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, ... As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all. They are values, commodity values, end quote. As a side note, that emphasis that I put on social substance is an emphasis from me, not from Kliman. Okay, that's the end of section 3. I'm going to cut this video in half here, just to keep the videos short and manageable. Thanks for listening. The next section is titled, which is section 4, is titled Significance of the Concept of Intrinsic Value.